everyone. Welcome to the Lounge Podcast, episode 20. It says 19 here. Don't worry about that. Today I have with me Shona Lester, RT, and Kite. Hey guys, how are you? Hey.
Greetings, Earthlings.
Yeah. So today we're the topic we're dealing with. It can go quite a lot of ways, but I think it's really interesting. It's about just like using history as inspiration to help, I guess, shape your story, or using lessons of history in a narrative, in a story, and just kind of like, I guess, a general
Yeah,
thoughts on that. Um,
yeah, yeah. So this was my topic. I think I should try explaining my thought process. So essentially, this does come from like the historian in me. Like, history is something I'm quite passionate about.
mm,
And I have sort of thought that, and I've sort of thought like particularly with world building, with fantasy worlds, like there's sort of lessons to be had of just sort of going back to real life examples that happened in the past and sort of
mm,
building out the world, and also like lessons of like particular peoples as
mm,
such. So I think, while I will freely admit I still have not watched or read any of this, Game of Thrones I think is a good example, because that's something like, as you like, since as it's mainstream, a good majority of people who've seen the series likely do not know much about medieval history as to how it works, but they still like find enjoyment of that.
mm,
Sort of, from what little I do know of it, and people who have watched it, please do like chime in. It is essentially a war of secession. Uh, and particularly if you look back at like medieval wars of secession, particularly like deconstructing of what a kingdom was back then, because essentially, like a lot of people now uh, think like in kingdoms it was the king that was the center of the entire kingdom. What he says is law, and what he says must happen.
mm,
Well, that is true on paper, like particularly with like the divine right of kings. In practice, that's not always the case, and you have cases, particularly with a great example, France, where you had duchies that had more power than the king himself, because they had more land, they had more influence, they had the money, and could particularly exert influence over the king. And then particularly with French history, this did lead to a lot of
mm.
instability within France, and sometimes in some of its most dire
Yeah.
circumstances,
So I
such
think
as
I
Hundred
guess
Years of War.
I guess I think swinging it back
Yeah,
into like the like in relation to stories and that stuff is where the written history sometimes, or this history that you hear, and then say for example you're doing a story and you want to have a rich history in there, and you think, okay, if X, Y, and Z happen, this is how it's gonna go. But then after when you start looking at history and using that as an example, you realize, oh, there's more layers to this than that. There's things went
yeah,
differently here, and then you can
So,
not sometimes you
yeah.
can use
So
that
it's
as
sort of like
yeah.
food for thought, like, because
Mm,
I will not say you need to have if you're making a fantasy world, you don't need to have a full grasp of history, like,
mm,
but especially like, because the beauty with like fantasy is you can come up with a lot of things, but I do find like, it's my general argument is like having some sort of not have like at least like a basic understanding
mm,
can sort of help sort of create uh have centering some ideas, and even like giving you some examples, like even not, and not even like from history, but also like real examples. I think one really good one I have is actually from a manga called Radiant, which is a French manga, and
mm,
its second arc in particular, when I was reading it, I did sort of find parallels with sort of what was happening in France. It's in like what was known as the Arab Spring,
mm,
and you just had this like and particularly not just France, but all of Europe, the sort of migration into Europe and the attitude, these sort of mixed attitudes towards it. That's the best I can describe. Yeah, that's hopefully putting some context into this topic. I appreciate this was probably not the most well thought out topic I could have.
Nah.
So, I to kind of ground this a bit, because I think the issue that we might be having is that the topic might be a little bit too broad. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to see if I can help to narrow it down a bit. So
Please.
let me take a look at the topic one more time. Let me just make sure that I am following it properly. All right. So basically, history in fantasy settings. So let's use an example here. So the thing is, when it comes to history and pretty much the narrative of humanity, all of this stuff by default will influence stories in some shape or form. This is why whenever anyone will come at you with the whole politics and stories thing or politics in my media, I think a lot of them kind of miss the point. Because the thing is, politics, history, and very much
Oh no.
as they are, or at least as hard hitting as they are. So let's try to.
1 second, I'm switching around. I forgot to change.
We're kind of seeing right now. Let's look at The Last of Us Part 2 for a second. I do understand that this is a very, very polarizing game, depending on who you ask. Of course, I got my opinions on it myself. However, not too long ago mentioned something along the lines of the conflict between the Seraphites and the WLF is heavily based on the conflict. Now, before the situation got to where it is right now, what Drunkman mentioned is that when he had noticed violence taking place against a specific member of the faction, it had him have a moment of complete and utter frustration and anger. But once he had this moment to kind of step back and consider the context of the situation, he found himself not as angry, but he can see what happens to people who get so knee deep into this conflict without taking a minute to sit back and think. He's seen what happens when you fall so deep into this rabbit hole of anger and hatred, to the point where that was the very impetus of the story to kind of let us know of what happens when we sink so far down into hatred and anger that we fail to see the bigger picture in the end. So that is one example of a conflict, one that's happening right now, influencing a particular story. There are other ones that I can point to, but to kind of lay the groundwork for the rest of you guys to follow up on, the idea of looking at history, whether it is the history of a political system, the history of great leaders, or just the history of specific people, let's call them great men or great women for the time, many of our stories hearken to these ideas, whether we're aware of them or not. And you'd be surprised just how many aspects of our stories that we can find within history. Like Final Fantasy Tactics: The War of the Lions is heavily influenced by the War of the Roses. Game of Thrones is also very much influenced by the War of the Roses. Now, without really going into all of that stuff in history, without going on all of that with the names and different terms and all that, at the end of the day, there's a chance that what you're working on has some degree of historical precedent, basically.
Yeah, it's true. Like, because like we are just by the fact that our past is what affects our future and affects how we go about things in the world. It's more or less inevitable. I think in terms of writing it just comes down to one, how aware you are of it, which is quite important if you want to make actual use of it and probably help use it, like properly use it to your advantage in a story, and just two, like, I guess how much research you do into a history, or maybe a history you've maybe accidentally stumbled upon by writing a story, and using that as a lesson to maybe either retell that story in a different way, or maybe try to extrapolate a lesson from it, or even just, like, I don't know, have an alternate of that historical thing. So you're taking it as inspiration, but you're kind of taking it a different direction because you wanted to you want it to express something else. So I think, 100%. Like it's kind of, I mean, depending on the story, you don't have to go deep into history, but just by the fact that usually characters' actions and motivations are products of their past. Their past is part of history, in the general sense. Then it just comes down to how aware are you of the history of your story, and how much you're going to use that, or how much research you're going to use to make that.
And not only that, but it's also the history of the times as well within the area that you're in.
Yeah.
Like anime such as Akira are very much steeped in the eras that they were released in, or the eras that they were released after. A lot of the
Gundam
whole
too is also
biker gang.
Yeah.
Oh, especially like
manga.
Gundam. Yeah, like Gundam, it's very obvious to catch that the whole colony drop thing isn't too far off from the idea of the atom bomb dropping on Hiroshima. It's not too far off from it, because the moment that bomb dropped, the world changed. Within the 0079 era or timeline, what we end up having is a situation where the world as we know it ends up changing due to a massive amount of death of innocent people. And there is no other country in the planet that can communicate feelings that raw more than the country that actually experienced getting nuked in the first place. So we have that as an example, and of course we have like the social issues of the era, like with Akira having motorcycle gangs. Like motorcycle gangs were very much a rising issue for the youth. It was very easy for people in post-war Japan to fall into these groups to begin with, because at this point their way of life as they knew it had been completely wiped out, or at least heavily hampered after the bomb was dropped. So what you end up having are a lot of wayward youths trying to find a purpose. So they turn to these biker gangs to at least feel some sense of belonging, because the world that their parents knew had basically been gone overnight. That's not to say that there weren't traces of it and there weren't ways to rebuild it. But in the era of occupation, this era of trying to rebuild after that war, it's no surprise that a lot of youths are going to end up becoming wayward. So then you end up having Kaneda, Tetsuo, and all these other folks who are trying to make sense out of this world, but they end up either acting out, they commit acts of violence, become addicted to drugs. Like, when you have a situation that's so close to reality, that's adapted into a story, it ends up feeling a hell of a lot more raw, due to the fact that these people at least have the writers behind it and the staff, they have a clear concept of what this scene actually looks like. So a lot of the environmental aspects, a lot of the historical aspects of it all, just to kind of tie back around it, very much lean to the idea of our stories fundamentally, no matter how hard we try to separate them from reality, they have some point of reference that we can draw, whether we want to admit it or not. Like, hell, if you want a more literal example of this, like the Fate Stay Night franchise, or just Type Moon in general, they are very much steep in history, myths, and regardless of how much they may gender bend or anything like that, the fact remains is they are still playing very fast and loose with ideas that we are already aware of, as well as myths that we already know of. So if you have the more literal examples like Fate, and then you have the more, let's say,
what's it called? Hello?
Is that mine?
No, I can hear you.
Okay.
I think it might be Kite's connection.
Okay.
Okay. Well, until it gets back, I'll just continue. I did also think, because we've.
Oh no!
Okay.
I muted myself intentionally because I was done.
Oh, okay. Oh, I think it cut off when you were middle of speaking. So I thought you still.
Yeah, it sounded like you cut off then.
Okay, got you. All right. Yeah. Also, I was gonna say with regards to history, because we talk like in fantasy settings as well. Yeah. I think the more, obviously, it depends on your story and how the character and how much that history is gonna be relevant. And I think we've talked about this iceberg thing as well, where the writer ideally should know. Well, not ideally. They should know at least a bunch more than what the reader's gonna get, and or what's gonna be put on the page. So it's kind of by that right, they should know a good deal about the history, even though it may not be shown in the story. Don't have to be super deep. So in terms of like fantasy, like the general fantasy, I say that already holds true. I find interesting though. I find the difference between how history tends to be used. It depends on the genre. For like example, I feel like sci-fi has. When I read history, I think sci-fi sounds more out. Yeah, because it's more like
sci-fi is like very interesting. Yeah, it's because like a lot of like particularly old, like going back like. I'm gonna say like American movies in like the '80s, like sci-fi movies in the '80s, do sort of echo kind of what the attitudes of that era. So
War of the Worlds,
a lot of them like particularly,
and that's no coincidence either. Did you notice that a good chunk? Did you notice that a good chunk of the villains in those movies just so happen to be Russian?
Oh yeah,
really makes you think, huh?
Definitely product of its time.
Yeah, and sort of also the kind of like imagining of like what technology would be like. So that's why like with a lot of like particularly like with I'm gonna say like Aliens is a really good example. The retro sci-fi aesthetic of like still using like cassette tapes, paper, because that's what they thought, and it's sort of and also like even like with Aliens sort of echoes the capitalism as sort of grown into this sort of almost oppressive force. Like with the sort of opening of Aliens was with Ripley in the meeting with the representatives of the company to explain why she destroyed an entire shipment of, and I think this was like $40 billion worth of assets.
And I think what's interesting about because they
and you just see like how frustrated she's gets saying like I've been telling, how many times do you want me to tell you the same story? And then like particularly in the extended version, like if you just watch that scene, particularly with the extended version, it is essentially your sort of protagonist who just went through hell trying to talk to a cold board meeting, which was, sort of this was sort of what capitalist America was. It was sort of bureaucracy. It was money, and like particularly sci-fi of that era just always depicted it as this just this cold, stoic, almost soulless entity.
But I think what is it with sci-fi? I find in general with sci-fi, but I find interesting. Whether it's a cautionary tale or a tale of how awesome the future could be, it's always extrapolating an idea or something from that present, using the past, using history to extrapolate. Okay, is this thing got taken to 11? This thing got too extreme in like 100 or 200 years time. Where would we be? Where would it be? Would it be good? Would it be bad? So I think that's what I find interesting about sci-fi when it deals with history. It kind of uses you're usually far off in the future. Usually something.
Even particularly, there's an episode where it first encounters the Romulans. And when they sort of see that they actually resemble Vulcans, some of the crew get suspicious of Spock, who is a Vulcan, and that's sort of a direct comparison to the Red Scare of America, where sort of you see where sort of the enemy could be anywhere.
And it's interesting that you brought that aspect up, James, because this is an aspect that Japan has commented on before within a lot of their media, be it their video games or within their movies. Best example I can really point to right now is Hideo Kojima's Snatcher. The Snatcher concept basically was meant to kind of parallel the whole McCarthyism angle, or the idea of communists are hidden among us, or our enemies are always, or the Reds are always here. Basically, the idea for Snatcher is, in a nutshell, they would kidnap various important people within the government or specific people to get closer to the private sector. They would then hide amongst them, and then when the time came, they would propagate, they would spread all over, they would then take over Japan after that. But the trouble with a lot of them is that they are not capable of living out in the sunlight, according to what the story told us. So this was a situation of Kojima very much having his finger on the pulse of the Red Scare, as well as other aspects that kind of led us to that point. There are other political and social ramifications that are discussed as well. I just thought it was interesting that you meant that you were bringing up that side of of American history.
Yeah. Also, I don't know. Speaking a bit about the Kojima, like I can't say I've played his games fully, but I've seen some stuff, and I remember you probably guys might know it more because you seem to be more in Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah.
But there's this speech in one of them from like I think Metal Gear Solid 2, and it's like
That's correct.
so eerily accurate to like how things are now. So
the ending of Metal Gear Solid 2, where it was where Raiden, like before Raiden faces off with Solidus, he's contacted by the Colonel and Rose, who revealed themselves as the actual Patriots, and they sort of revealed essentially their entire program was to defend against was to sort of shield the internet from what they called junk data, with just sort of a world without context and just everyone just throwing unfiltered information and just creating mass chaos. And this was,
and ironically,
was 2001.
Yeah.
And now here we are, a good 22 years later, and we're seeing the ramifications of that prediction just laid bare. It's very prophetic. The crazy thing about this in general is when you pay attention to specific trends within humanity, you can see specific things happening long before they start to come out. So it's like when you have an understanding of of history, our behavior, our patterns, our social movements regarding within the current day, or even in the past, there's going to be a singularity point where you're going to be like, here's what I think is going to happen. This is how it might happen. How do we stop it? I don't know. I don't think it's possible.
Yeah, and I think it kind of brings me back to when I always said, like, if there was a job writers had, it would be kind of looking at the society how it is now through like a past and everything, and then just like putting together something to show people, hey, this is something we should keep an eye on. Maybe we shouldn't do that again. And putting in basically putting that into a story, like that kind of idea. If there was a job, I put it like I'm air quoting here. So it's just it's really interesting that like there'll be stories where people like look at the past and like extrapolate kind of what could happen, and it gets really interesting when you see something that's like, hey, that was made how many years ago? This is really ahead of its time, wasn't it? And it makes you wonder, like, because I imagine it's not just one person who saw that, but like it just makes you wonder, like, what was the people thoughts on it back then? I guess some of these things you could probably find out, but it's like they're thinking, yeah, that's just so well off. This guy's insane. After like a couple years later, it's like, oh, I guess we're living in the yeah. So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
I mean, a lot of these stories tend to come from those who can see the tides shifting for what they are, and every now and again there may be a case where no one really predicted things would turn out the way they did.
Yeah, true.
But unconsciously, and then just paying attention enough, you're likely going to get something right.
Yeah.
There's always going to be a situation where everyone is going to try to take a dartboard and kind of try to throw a dart at the board and determine, okay, where it's going to land. There's always going to be people who are going to do that, but whether or not it lands is going to be very much dependent on the day. But I guarantee you, someone who has a finger on the pulse, they know their history.
They're more than likely.
Yeah, they are more than likely going to be more correct than the other guys who tried. Because a couple of years ago, we all thought we would be flying cars and everything.
Yeah,
I
literally remember people saying, yeah, 2015 will be flying cars. I specifically remember this when I was like, what, 6, 7.
Like, you see, that's what...
Go.
Yeah, 2019, back from the future.
Back to the Future as well. Yeah, they had the whole thing around that point.
That's what everyone wanted. But could you imagine this can you imagine this technocracy, this clear dystopic edge kind of factor that Kojima predicted all those years ago? Like, could you imagine that would be the future that we would land on? Of all things, like, really, really makes you think for a second, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is really, really fascinating. It's just like, I think the Matrix, to a good degree, has I don't know how close was it when it came, but yeah, in some ways,
yeah, it was
Matrix has a lot of-
1990.
Hell,
no,
Serial Experiments Lane caught onto this as well. I mean, granted, its idea of the internet, depending on who you ask, might seem a bit laughable in today's standards, but the end result really isn't too far off from what we're seeing these days. So what we have is a situation of people learning from the past, but now not only that, but understanding the past in order to understand where the future is headed. That's the dynamic that we end up having as a result of this conversation, or as a result of the thoughts we have.
Yeah, which goes to show like the past. Looking at the past is really.
It
just helps enrich what you're gonna write as well. It's back to can I bring all back to writing?
Yeah, I think a good example, one that just sort of came to me is sort of, like say in a fantasy world, and then say there's like been a new continent that's been discovered, and just this rush to sort of see the new wonders of that. That can very much taken from the discovery of America, and then the colonization rush to sort of it's sort of a way to sort of explore the wonders of this world, to find like the cities of gold. But then sort of, and with like a lot of like with some of these stories, you does sometimes focus on like how like the native people see this. Like one of my favorite films is Road to El Dorado, which is based on like these two sort of gamblers who flee Spain and wind up stumbling on the legend city of gold, discovered by its people, and the people start revering them as gods. Because like for one, they're riding a horse.
That has happened. That was the case for some of the conquistadors when they arrived in South America.
Yeah, so that's sort of the clash between the new and the old world, and kind of sometimes the apocalyptic nature of what that could bring to particularly the natives of that area, because essentially the coming of the Europeans destroyed much of American civilization of that era. Like the old American civilizations were essentially wiped out by a mixture of both conquest, but also the diseases brought by the Europeans. And then you had the Northern American tribes that sort of very slowly began to lose all their lands and even like their way of life, to sort of, while not being like completely destroyed, because like they're not, but sort of integrating into like general American society, sort of living now like now in sort of how American houses rather than on the plains. So it's a mixture of like a people like being destroyed to a people being forced to adapt to
being incorporated into like
the new world
sort of system going on. But I think, I don't know, just thinking it more because I was earlier with sci-fi, I was thinking like they usually use the past to help like make a shoot off into the future with like certain ideas and kind of wonder what would happen if this happened, or cautionary tale of, hey, maybe we shouldn't make this technology and make it like this, otherwise this could happen. I think with fantasy, I'm just trying to feel like a general pattern I'm noticing. I think with fantasy, it's more like history is a teacher, and mankind tends to, although it doesn't happen the exact same way, we tend to repeat ourselves, and we're easy to forget what happened.
Yeah,
and I think what is interesting,
particularly like if you go like
fantasy.
I think like I'd say like there's a good reason why like medieval settings usually used for a fantasy world, because it was sort of because like going to sort of medieval Europe specifically, the world was much smaller back then, and you also had sort of like, I think very The Witcher 3 sort of mixed which is a good blend of the mysticism and the horror of like what a lot of like particularly rural people felt like there could be something waiting in the woods. There could be this monster ready to pounce. And then on the offset, you also have the constant wars between the kingdoms. So in the Witcher 3's case, in Velen, he sort of the war between Nilfgaard and the northern kingdoms, and just the sort of devastation it wrought to the population.
Oh, did it cut off?
Can anyone hear me? The audio
Yeah,
just dropped for a second.
Yeah, same. I thought it cut off. Did you finish talking or did it just cut off? Oh, Lester? Okay.
Okay, one sec.
Okay. Alright, no problem. Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. Hopefully this works.
Alright, no worries.
But yeah, and also because I was talking about that, and also like rob bandit, because essentially now, when with like villages devastated, armies going across, going back and forth, you just have this like say banditry problem with like even like one of the story arcs of Velen is with the Bloody Baron, who's essentially a robber barony, and sort of acts as kind of a mercenary to the Nilfgaard Guardians.
Yeah.
And the resolution, and no matter what way you resolve that story, the situation for the people get even worse because the successor to the Bloody Baron is even worse.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I can imagine because I haven't played Witcher too hard, so I can't say I'm too deep in anything. I watched the show. I watched the show. Actually, I read 1 or 2 books. But anyways, yeah. But yeah, it is. I do feel like the difference between like sci-fi and fantasy when it comes to how they deal with history is, fantasy kind of has a more cyclical thing where they look at history and then they'll kind of reflect that again. Like if someone's going to use history deliberately, it'll usually be reflected again, showing the lessons
that's
of
sort of it, like...
of the thing. And sci-fi is more like, here's what's happened in the past. Here's usually some technology or just the civilization in general. Let's shoot off how far into the future with a particular set of things we've got to focus on, and see if this can look hopeful or bad. Is it a cautionary tale or not? I think that's just
Actually, you made like a good point because essentially, like medieval like fantasy in the past usually sometimes takes lessons of history, whereas a lot of sci-fi sort of takes like a lot of it takes contemporary problems and sort of thinks, what would it be like in the future?
But both of them can be warnings and or just like a hope.
Yeah, warnings.
I don't think they're nearly as binary as that. However, I don't think they're that strict because you can use any of these settings as a vehicle for any contemporary issue you choose. Because at this point, when it comes to like using a fantasy setting, you can use a fantasy setting to kind of be an allegory for current racial structures and injustices. You can use them for that, or you can have a situation where you can use a sci-fi setting to do the same thing. One of the reasons why Osamu Tezuka's work within Astro Boy is so timeless is that it's very much steeped in this idea of the struggle between humans and robots coming together, or where does the line between human and robot really begin and where does it end. We're still having conversations like this to this very day. Once this eventually happens, we're going to have to contend with these questions too. If you ask me, I feel like whichever setting you use, both of them are capable of doing the same thing. It really is just dependent on what we're using it as a vehicle for. Like, are we using this race here and where they are in the world as an allegory for a specific race, or is this like supposed to be an echo of a conflict that we know had existed at some point in our history? Like, a fantasy setting can still be used for that and can still discuss contemporary stuff like that, and the sci-fi setting can do the same thing. So it's I just don't know if it's that strict or it's that binary. I think there's valid examples for both. Like you can find aspects
Oh no,
of this
yeah,
within The Witcher.
there's definitely wiggle room
Yeah,
for
yeah.
both. Like even just
Yeah,
watching The Expanse, it's
clearly.
in the future. There's many other planet stuff, but the conflict they're going through is a conflict we had through since man found a stick and threw it at another guy. It's differences.
Exactly,
So I definitely agree.
because what
I think
because what you have in
God.
the Expanse is a situation of you have humans, and then you have the humans on Earth and the humans on Mars, but then you have the humans in the belt. The thing is, I'm emphasizing humans because at the end of the day, that's what they all are. But the thing is that what makes them different is the fact that they all inhabit different parts of the galaxy. So because of that, you have different cultures. So fundamentally, you have the belt that doesn't trust either of them because the belt doesn't fit neatly into either Earth or Mars. It is a setting that is within the stars. So technically speaking, anyone can become a belter, but a belter, due to their very physiology, cannot necessarily become an Earther or a Mars person at that point. So this is clearly a case where the writers of The Expanse are very much aware of cultural differences as well as cultural backgrounds. So, but guess what? But like you kind of implied earlier, there's nothing that's stopping The Expanse from being a fantasy setting where the same thing is happening. The belt, for all we know, could be an isolated island somewhere. It could still fit the same way. It just happens to be in a sci-fi setting.
No, I agree. I think what I mean is when I say they use history in different ways is where sci-fi they'll use kind of like the technology or an environment as a thing to show, okay, if we took this thing and went into the future, this is how things would change. So I'm saying by using history, they've made that extrapolation. And yeah, sure, you can make that. You can use that set. You can use them ideas and bring it to the present. But it is even in Expanse, like how the Belters and they're all humans, like you said, but how the Belters are separated from the Earth, the Martians and the Earth, the Martians, the Earthlings, is their physiology, and that's due to being in space. And we like, I don't know, unless you have a fantasy story when in space. But like, I've thought in general, usually the idea that they take in the sci-fi is usually something that can. It's something that we only can really imagine happening in the future most of the time because hence sci-fi you taking things to the future. So that I think that difference. But yeah, you're right in terms of what you can do with it. You can because history is always. I always believe that more things change, more they stay the same. So even in the future, that's going. We're gonna still be humans. We just have bigger guns, and the stuff we'll be confronting will be different. Like dealing with space that we never had to deal with down here. So that's what I meant by the differences. But yeah, we're still humans, and we're still gonna be doing the same things and fall into the same mistakes. I agree. Cool. All right. Cool. Is there anything more you want to say on this, or should we do closing thoughts?
Yeah, I've got nothing
Okay.
to
Yeah.
say.
Now, to be honest, for considering how broad the topic is, I think we
Yeah,
nailed it to a decent degree. I think.
I just want to thank Kite for sort of really grounding it because I really didn't think that. I really didn't think that was much.
No, it's okay. That's the
Pointed
reason why I'm
out.
here. I'm mostly also here to help you
Yeah,
guys where I can.
and thanks for bearing with me while
Not a problem.
I get my thoughts together.
Nah, yeah, really gonna help like summarize things, which is good. I have another topic, but I don't know. My thought was because this is kind of in the same ballpark. Should we go for it? But now that I'm thinking on it, it's like cosmic lore and telling stories of how like basically that the lore, the background lore.
This is another one. I think this one's a good one because this is another one I have, and it's at least one I've got at least a bit more clearer explanation for it. So so basically, to summarize, it's essentially cosmic law is essentially the actual building blocks
in the beginning
or universe. And I think it's like a very interesting topic because I've seen cases where it's been done very well and sort of adds to sort of sort of like the enjoyment or like the benediction of like sticking to like particular narrative. And then I've seen the opposite where it kind of either destroys sort of the mysticism of the world or just becomes like needlessly convoluted. So two examples, one or the other. One good example I have for the former is Final Fantasy XIV, with particularly the lore surrounding the world of basically the world in the source. So I don't want to spoil it too much, but essentially there's a single world with 14 shards that were sort of broken off when sort of the old civilization collapsed. And you have sort of a group that particularly is trying to restore the original world, even if it comes at the detriment to and the literal destruction of basically the people living there. And it's one that is really that can sort of seem very generic and it can be very polarizing. Particularly with the Shadowbringers expansion, is where you actually and it's someone I've mentioned before, the main antagonist of that expansion, Emmett Selk, where you sort of kind of start to see the point of view from the other side, and sort of why, and sort of really adds to sort of your appreciation of what is built. And it's not something that came like out of left field, but it feels like very still grounded. Like, it is Final Fantasy, and Final Fantasy is known to doing really crazy stuff. But it's successful in sort of grounding it. And then on the opposite end, I'm actually going to say Magi, where it's sort of it's where during the conference between I'm trying to remember the nations. Well, Sinbad.
Because I don't. From what I remember, because I'm not fully watching Maggie and Final Fantasy 14.
Yeah, because I read the.
Because
I read the manga with Magi, and let's just say the lore gets. For me personally, what is revealed by Aladdin during that, and the actual lore and like the world that came before, it kind of did destroy my sort of love of this world, because it swept the mysticism away.
Okay.
And it just felt so like cold and technical, to the point where even after it, I kept trying to read it. There's just something in the back of my head just thinking back to that.
When you say cold and technical, that's not how I remembered Magi when I read it.
Yeah, it's actually when it.
I can think.
The thing is, so that's sort of what is sort of revealed. It's sort of the world of David and Solomon that came before, and then what the Ruch actually is, and then where Alaman actually sprung forth from. And and the direction it takes at the end with Sinbad kind of just was enough to sort of have me conk out of the series altogether. And it's just like, I just think like, because it might just be like a me thing, but it was definitely one that, because with Final Fantasy XIV, it made me really appreciate sort of the world and the writing. I'm sure there are people who will feel the opposite to that. And then with Magi, it just kind of ruined a bit of like I
guess more of this question is
removed,
more. I think with the
essentially
question, Sorry.
essentially with this stuff, it is removing them, because the sort of the inner workings of like the mystical world. It's what makes it amazing is that it is unknown to us. We don't know about it, and then it's sort of when you sort of take that out of it's sort of like Pandora's box. When you open it,
there's no mystery, but
the mystery goes. So either you will resonate with it and you own, and in my experience, if I end up not resonating with it, it can sort of ruin Like, even if that stuff after that's good,
Yeah.
it just sort of ends
But I
up
think,
ruining it.
I guess this question is more about like, how do you get for like in terms of if you're writing a story now and you're
Yeah,
gonna
it's just how
make a
to sort
lore, you would like how would you
of,
go about it? Like, would it you wouldn't? I
yeah,
guess
sort of
I
how
guess
do
I guess at
you-
least with your example, you can just say, well, it's you don't want it to just you don't want to give all your cards, put all your cards on the table for one. Two,
yeah,
if
you
you're going
don't
to
want
do
just
it, if you're going to
reveal
do
your
it,
hand
yeah.
right away.
If you're going to do it eventually,
So-
it shouldn't happen at the beginning. But if you're going to do it eventually, it should make it at least more interesting than just I don't know whatever happened in Maggie. I can't say what happened in
Yeah.
Maggie. But yeah.
Is the question that we're asking, how do we apply quote unquote like a cosmic level of lore or something like that to our work? Basically?
I'd say that's the best way to really answer the
I'd say
question.
it's like
Otherwise,
how to-
we'll just
Yeah, it's sort of more
banter
like
about
how to handle it. Because
So-
I think cosmic lore is something that you can sort of come up with sort of as you're doing it. But it's sort of when it comes to okay, I'm going to sort of lay out the cards. It's sort of the way to do it, if that makes sense. Like, 'cause there's no right or wrong answer. Like, you can do.
I think
sometimes you can just
I think there's a way that you can do it, even from my experience and from seeing what I've seen. So the way how I see cosmic lore is, or just putting cosmic theming within your work in general. I think I'll just lean towards cosmic theming more than anything else right now. But the thing with cosmic or just stuff that is beyond the understanding of the characters, the idea is you need to have something that's defined right in front of them that they do understand. What you can define as cosmic, it's like what's behind the curtain, basically. It's what's behind the curtain that might come across as incomprehensible, but we know it exists. Now, are we capable of understanding it? Probably not, and neither is the character. That's when things start to get cosmic. Because when we think cosmic, we think things like the Lovecraft mythos. And the reason why the Lovecraft mythos is as hard hitting as it is, it's because it is genuinely baffling. Like, we can make sense out of some things, but it plays to our sense of fear and our sense of the unknown. So what I think cosmic lore should be, or cosmic theming, is that it plays to that same notion. An example that I'm going to use to ground this is the Mobius arc within Star Wars. Now, just to kind of sum it up for people who've never watched it, and I don't really want to dwell on it for too long, but basically, we understand the Force is this form of energy that exists in all life. It can be used to push people away, it can be used to generate lightning, that kind of thing. The Mobius arc within Star Wars kind of explained the origin of where this came from. It gave us 3 specific figures that we can reference. But the thing is, despite the fact that the Mobius arc was kind of pulling the curtains back on the Force, we still don't have a clear and full understanding of where this madness comes from.
Yeah.
We're given like a right. We're kind of given like a peek at how it looks like, and the further back that we go into learning these secrets, the more disturbing and unhinged it all becomes. Now, depending on who you ask, it might not be that frightening, but to the characters, it is genuinely unsettling to you to be going back this far into the past. And even when we come out at the other end of it, the only thing we get is a prophecy for what's to come. So basically, it is clear that these cosmic machinations that are completely outside of the character's wherewithal and knowledge, we know they exist, but we're just not really capable of making sense out of all of it. It simply exists in spite of everything else. And it also exists indirectly in service to everything else. So I think if we're going to be talking about cosmic, what we need to lean in on is, what does it mean in the grand scheme? Is it something that we can understand? And if it is something that we can understand, who can understand it? And what are the motivations of the person who can understand it? Does it exist in service to itself? Does it exist in service to everything else? Or is it just a rabbit hole of lore and myth that may or may not play a centerpiece in your story? Because, like I said before, it's basically like you're pulling the curtains back. So if you're going into that aspect, you will need a specific reason as to why you're opening up the curtains. But if you ask me, though, I think the best way to handle it, of course, don't answer every question that you think needs to be answered, because at that point it's not cosmic anymore. Some things just happen, you know? Some things just kind of happen. Like to kind of close my point off, to kind of give in what I mean by things can just happen, let me use a more grounded example that you probably wouldn't have given a second thought. So let's say at the season finale of Breaking Bad, one of the seasons, I can't remember which one, there was a plane accident, right? Between two carriers, I think it was like a first class plane and another one, I can't remember. But what I can tell you is they crash into each other. Yes, that's what's important. Now, I bet you're wondering, how in the world did that happen? Well, here's what happened. The airline traffic director's daughter basically died the previous day, and he wasn't focused at work. And then all of a sudden, that one mistake that was perpetuated by one man.
I think a cough.
Lining two planes at the perfect time to crash into each other. It seems so random, so out of the way, but guess what? That's just the universe. You can't control it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It might not make a lot of sense. Even if you can ground the fact that this happened to his daughter, where in the world did that second plane come from, huh? Well, that's the thing. It doesn't make sense. It may make sense when you ground it, but it just feels like it's so out there, so out of the way. It comes across as nonsensical. That's just cosmic stuff in a nutshell. It's not supposed to make sense.
Yeah, I think before you mentioned it as like cosmic and like more emphasis on the cosmic lore, I was kind of more going through the angle of just like the background story of how most of things have begun. And to be fair, I guess that in its own way is cosmic lore. Like you could even say in the Bible when it says, be like when God made everything. So, well, okay, he made everything. Like, how? Doesn't necessarily say he got cement and started building everything in it. It's just like he just made everything. You just have to kind of accept that. So I guess even in that right, even though I was going to go for example sort of along that angle, that is in that sense cosmic lore. I guess another thing I think of when I think of cosmic lore is, like it should be in the background and it should be mysterious, and also I think because in the background, because it's mysterious, it's, I don't know, like, yeah, I think I had another point, but like to bring like I said, to bring it to the foreground will diminish its point of being a cosmic law. By that point, it won't be law, like I said. But also, I had it, I lost it again. 1 second. Yeah, because cosmic law is also also that's it. Connection. It needs. I think, even though it's not understood, I think it's nice to have it connected in some ways to things that are understood. Which I guess even in your example that still kind of rings true. Like, okay, you know the plane crashed, you know why the plane crashed, but how did this happen? You don't know. So I guess in that sense, there's still that connection to reality with things. So I think with, like, if you were to, in my head, I imagine have a concept in your world of cosmic entity, because I know in my story I won't go into details, but I have the power system. Then beyond that power system is something more ethereal, more soft magic. Then beyond that is stuff that we just cannot comprehend, and that is the building block of everything. It all goes in a cycle and trickles into each other. But the top of it will be the cosmic law. It's the stuff that we just don't understand and have to accept that it works, and it bleeds into the things that we do. It bleeds into the things that we barely understand, but we have enough bit of control of, and then bleeds into things we understand more scientifically and we have control of. So I think, if you were to do it in a story, should let it be mysterious. It doesn't have to be. Its mechanisms doesn't have to be explained. Ideally, if you're gonna it's gonna be cosmic. Ideally, I can't think of too much situation where you make it explained unless you're really going for some sort of subversion. But also, I think it's really cool to have it kind of connected to things that are understood and are known. If you're going to have it as an entity ish, so yeah, that's kind of my thing. It's just like it can be cosmic, but it can still be connected in some ways to the machinations of the world. And there's just levels to that understanding, because in reality I think that's kind of how science works. There's the things we understand, and then there's the things we think we understand by theory, then there's things we just have no idea of, and whether we will ever know what those things are in our lifetime or in the humanity's lifetime is another question altogether. But the fact is, those things are there, and those things help make these things work. But we just don't understand. We just understand this level. We don't understand the levels beyond. So I think that, at least in my head, having it connected is kind of congruent to how it works in real life. All right, guys. This has been episode 20 of the Lounge Podcast. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to you guys for taking part. It was really good.
Certainly.
All right, guys. See you in the next one. Take care. Bye.